Why did my dad's girlfriend lock me in my room while I was going into diabetic shock? The key turned in the lock from the outside, and I heard Simone's heels clicking away down the hallway while my hands were already shaking too badly to hold my phone. My blood sugar monitor showed 48 and dropping, that terrifying freefall that meant I had maybe 20 minutes before I'd lose consciousness completely. I'd been reaching for my emergency glucose tablets when I heard her coming up the stairs, and now the bottle was on the floor somewhere in the darkness, scattered across the carpet after I'd knocked it over trying to get to the door. Simone's voice carried through the wood, sweet and apologetic, telling my dad downstairs that I was having one of my teenage moods and needed time alone to calm down before his business associates arrived for dinner. She said I'd been rude about her cooking and disrespectful about the evening's importance, that I'd locked myself in on purpose to sabotage the dinner party she'd spent weeks planning. My dad's response was muffled but agreeable, trusting her version of events like he always did, and I realized with crystalline horror that she'd just condemned me to die alone in my bedroom while they entertained clients downstairs. The glucose tablets were somewhere in the dark, my spare insulin was in the kitchen refrigerator, and my CGM was alarming on my phone that I couldn't hold steady enough to dial 911. I was 15 years old with type 1 diabetes, and my father's girlfriend of 8 months had just locked me in my room to maintain the perfect atmosphere for her networking dinner. I'd been managing my type 1 diabetes for 6 years when Simone entered our lives, confident in my routine of checking blood sugar, counting carbs, and administering insulin through my pump. My mom had died when I was 7, and for the next 2 years, it had been just Dad and me figuring out life together, including my diabetes diagnosis at 9 that turned our world into a careful balance of numbers and timing. Dad was a commercial real estate developer who worked long hours but always made time for my endocrinologist appointments and never missed restocking my supplies. When he started dating again after Mom had been gone 3 years, I was supportive, wanting him to find happiness even though the idea of someone replacing Mom made my chest tight. Simone Blackwell was the 4th woman he'd dated seriously, and unlike the others who'd been kind but clearly uncertain about taking on a teenager with a chronic illness, Simone had seemed almost too perfect. She was 38 to Dad's 45, a pharmaceutical sales rep with a sophisticated wardrobe and the kind of confidence that made people listen when she spoke. She'd researched type 1 diabetes before meeting me, asked intelligent questions about my management routine, and even suggested a new insulin pump model her company didn't rep, but that had better features than mine. Dad had fallen hard and fast, and I'd tried to be happy for him, ignoring the small warning signs that Simone's perfection was a performance with an agenda I couldn't yet see. The first red flag had been subtle, appearing about 3 months into their relationship when Simone started commenting on my blood sugar numbers. She'd asked to see my readings each evening, framing it as caring concern, but her tone carried judgment when my numbers weren't perfect. She'd question whether I'd measured my carbs correctly, or suggest that maybe I was sneaking food I shouldn't have. Never mind that type 1 diabetes doesn't work that way, and my control was actually excellent according to Dr. Patel. When I'd tried to explain that blood sugar fluctuates for dozens of reasons beyond diet, Simone had smiled and said she worked in pharmaceuticals, so she understood medical conditions better than most people. Dad had nodded along, clearly impressed by her knowledge, and I'd let it drop even though her understanding was surface level and wrong in crucial ways. The second red flag came when she moved into our house after just 5 months of dating, bringing her designer furniture and her need to restructure our entire household routine. Suddenly, family dinners had to happen at exactly 6:30, regardless of my insulin timing, and my diabetes supplies had to be stored in designated areas that fit her aesthetic, rather than where they were most accessible for me. She'd reorganized the kitchen and moved my emergency glucose stash from the counter to a high cabinet because the packaging looked cluttered, and when I'd restocked the counter, she'd moved them again. Dad had mediated, suggesting I keep supplies in my room if Simone preferred a clean kitchen, not understanding that diabetes emergencies don't wait for you to run upstairs. I'd complied to keep the peace, adding a mini fridge in my room for insulin and keeping glucose tablets everywhere, sensing that pushing back would create conflict Dad couldn't handle. The third red flag had emerged last month when Simone started planning tonight's dinner party, a high-stakes evening with Dad's most important potential clients, the Thorntons, who owned a development company that could secure Dad's largest contract. Simone had taken over the planning completely, hiring caterers and event staff, transforming our house into something from a magazine spread. She'd been manic about details, snapping at both Dad and me when things weren't perfect, obsessing over lighting and music and the exact placement of flowers. When I'd asked about the menu and whether I could see carb counts for planning my insulin, Simone had waved me off and said she'd handle it, that I shouldn't worry about food and should just enjoy the evening. The dismissal had made my stomach drop because managing my diabetes meant I always needed to know what I was eating and when, but she'd made it sound like I was being difficult by asking. Yesterday, she'd informed me that I'd be eating dinner in my room tonight instead of joining the party because teenagers would make the evening feel too casual. Dad had protested weakly, saying I was part of the family and should be included, but Simone had insisted this was business, not family time, and my presence would shift the atmosphere away from professional networking. She'd promised to bring me a plate and said I could come down for dessert, making it sound reasonable even though we both knew she was excluding me to maintain her perfect image. I'd agreed because fighting with Simone always made Dad stressed and anxious, and I'd learned that keeping peace was easier than asserting my needs. This afternoon had been when everything shattered into crisis. Simone had been in the kitchen directing the catering staff when I'd come down around 4 to check my blood sugar and get a snack before dinner. My CGM had been trending down all afternoon, hovering in the low 80s, and I'd needed something to bring it up before it dropped into dangerous territory. I'd grabbed a juice box from the fridge, the quick sugar I relied on for these situations, when Simone had appeared beside me looking furious. She'd snatched the juice box from my hand and said I wasn't allowed to eat or drink anything before the dinner party because the caterers needed the kitchen clear and she couldn't have me disrupting their workflow. I'd tried to explain that my blood sugar was dropping and I needed the juice now, not later, but she'd cut me off and said I was being dramatic. She'd accused me of trying to sabotage her evening by creating medical situations that required attention, of being jealous that Dad had found someone new, of using my diabetes to manipulate situations. The accusations had been so shocking, so disconnected from reality, that I'd stood frozen while she'd thrown the juice box in the trash and told me to go to my room and stay there until she came to get me for dinner. When I'd protested, she'd stepped close and said in a low voice that if I caused any problems tonight, if I made a scene or tried to get Dad's attention away from his clients, she'd make sure he understood how manipulative I'd been about my medical condition. She'd reminded me that Dad's business was struggling, that this contract could save our family's finances, and that my selfishness could destroy everything he'd worked for. I'd gone upstairs shaking with anger and fear, my blood sugar now at 73 and dropping. I'd texted Dad that I needed help, but his phone was on silent for the client dinner preparations. I'd checked my supplies and realized my backup emergency glucose was in the kitchen where Simone had banned me, and my insulin pump was showing I had enough in the reservoir, but I'd need to change it tomorrow. The smart thing would have been to sneak downstairs and grab juice while Simone was busy, but I'd been paralyzed by her threats and Dad's dependence on tonight's success. Instead, I'd tried to manage with the glucose tablets I had in my room, taking 4 and waiting to see if my blood sugar would stabilize. For 30 minutes, I'd watched my CGM, seeing the numbers hover in the low 70s before starting to drop again. At 62, I'd known I needed more glucose, had grabbed the bottle to take more tablets, and that's when I'd heard Simone coming up the stairs. I'd gone to the door to ask her to bring juice, thinking that surely she wouldn't let me go into diabetic shock. But when I'd opened the door, she'd been standing there with her hand raised to knock. Her face had been cold and determined when she'd pushed me back into the room and said I was staying here until after the clients left because she couldn't trust me not to ruin her evening. She'd seen my glucose tablet bottle, had actually kicked it away when it fell, and then she'd walked out and locked the door from the outside with the key we'd never used, the old-fashioned mechanism Dad had thought was charming when we'd bought the house. Now I was on my hands and knees feeling across the carpet for scattered glucose tablets, my vision already starting to blur at the edges. My CGM was screaming alerts, showing 45 and still dropping, the rapid descent that meant I'd be unconscious soon. I found 3 tablets and chewed them frantically, the chalky sweetness normally reassuring but now just a reminder of how inadequate they were for this emergency. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip my phone when I finally managed to unlock it, but my fingers wouldn't cooperate with the touchscreen to dial 911. I tried Dad's number and it went straight to voicemail, his phone still silenced for the dinner party. I tried texting my best friend Anya, but the words came out as gibberish, autocorrect unable to make sense of my deteriorating motor control. Below me, I could hear the dinner party starting, voices greeting each other with professional warmth, Simone's laugh bright and charming as she welcomed the Thorntons into our home. The sounds were surreal against my reality, the normal social gathering happening while I was locked in my room dying from hypoglycemia. I thought about screaming for help, but Simone had turned on music downstairs, classical piano that would mask any noise from upstairs. She'd planned this perfectly, ensuring that even if I tried to get attention, the dinner party would continue undisturbed. I made it to my bed before my legs gave out completely, collapsing onto the mattress while my blood sugar continued its freefall. At 39, I knew I was in critical danger, the level where seizures and unconsciousness happen, where permanent brain damage becomes a real possibility. My thoughts were becoming fragmented and slow, the cognitive impairment that comes with severe hypoglycemia, making it hard to problem solve. I tried the door again, crawling because standing wasn't possible anymore, and pulled on the handle with strengthless hands. The lock held firm, and Simone had apparently taken the key with her because I couldn't see it in the old-fashioned keyhole. My window was on the second floor overlooking the backyard, too high to jump safely and facing away from the street where someone might see me. I considered breaking the window and screaming, but the dinner party was in the formal dining room on the opposite side of the house, and the catering staff were in the kitchen, and the music would cover any noise. Plus, breaking a window during Dad's most important business dinner would destroy the contract he desperately needed, would prove Simone right that I was trying to sabotage the evening. The thought trapped me between survival instinct and the psychological manipulation she'd spent months building, making me question whether dying quietly was better than disrupting her perfect night. My phone buzzed with a text from Anya asking if I wanted to video chat, and I tried to respond but my fingers wouldn't work anymore. The CGM was showing 34, critically low, and I could feel consciousness slipping away in waves. I thought about my mom, about how she'd never have let this happen, how she'd have put my health before any business dinner or social obligation. I thought about Dad downstairs completely unaware that his daughter was dying 20 feet above his head because he'd trusted his girlfriend over his own instincts. The anger that flashed through me was clarifying for a moment, cutting through the confusion, and I used that clarity to try one more time to call 911. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely see the screen, but I managed to hit the emergency call button before my vision tunneled to a pinpoint and then went black. I don't know if the call connected. I don't know if I said anything comprehensible. I only know that I felt myself falling into darkness while dinner party conversation and laughter echoed up through my bedroom floor. I woke up to voices arguing nearby and bright lights burning through my closed eyelids. Someone was saying my name, asking me to open my eyes, and when I managed to crack them open, I saw a paramedic's face hovering above me. She was young, maybe late 20s, with kind eyes and her hair pulled back in a bun, and she was telling me I was okay, that they'd given me glucagon and my blood sugar was coming back up. My arm hurt where an IV had been placed, and I could taste the sick, sweet residue of the glucagon injection that had saved my life. The paramedic introduced herself as Lindsay Kozak, said she was with LA County Fire Department, and asked if I could tell her what happened. My mouth was dry and my thoughts still foggy, but I managed to whisper that I'd been locked in my room. Lindsay's expression changed immediately, going from professional concern to sharp attention, and she asked me to repeat that. Behind her, I could see another paramedic talking to someone in the doorway, and through my still blurry vision, I recognized my dad's shape, his posture radiating panic and confusion. Lindsay leaned closer and asked very clearly who had locked me in the room and when, and I told her it was Simone, about 2 hours ago, right before the dinner party. The other paramedic turned at that, exchanged a look with Lindsay, and then I heard him call for the police officers who'd apparently responded with the ambulance. The next 30 minutes were a blur of medical assessment and careful questions. Lindsay stayed with me while her partner, an older man named Rick Duvall who'd been a paramedic for 18 years, took my vitals and tested my blood sugar again. They explained that 911 had received a call from my phone around 7:15, that they'd heard labored breathing and then silence, and when the dispatcher couldn't get a response, they'd sent emergency services to my location. The fire department had arrived first and found the front door locked with the dinner party in progress, had knocked loudly until someone answered, and then had to force their way upstairs when they heard my CGM alarm going off through my bedroom door. They'd found the door locked from the outside with the old skeleton key still in the lock, me unconscious on the floor with my blood sugar at 29, critically low for dangerously long. Rick said they'd administered glucagon immediately and called for police backup because the locked door situation raised red flags about possible neglect or abuse. Now there were 2 LAPD officers in my room, a woman named Detective Karen Flores who'd been with the force for 12 years and a uniformed officer named Jeff Nguyen, taking photographs of the door, the lock, and the scattered glucose tablets on my carpet. Detective Flores knelt beside my bed where the paramedics had moved me and asked if I felt well enough to answer questions. When I nodded, she pulled out a recording device and asked me to explain everything that had happened today, from the beginning. I told her everything, my voice getting stronger as my blood sugar normalized, the words tumbling out in a rush of anger and fear and relief. I explained about Simone moving my glucose supplies, about the juice box incident this afternoon, about her threats that I was sabotaging the dinner party, about her locking me in right as my blood sugar was crashing. Detective Flores listened without interrupting, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp, and when I finished, she asked specific questions about timing and exact words Simone had used. She asked if there were any witnesses to Simone's threats or any documentation like texts or recordings. I pulled up my text exchange with Dad from earlier showing my requests for help that had gone unanswered, showed her my CGM app data proving the blood sugar drop and critical alerts, and mentioned that the caterers might have seen the juice box incident this afternoon. Detective Flores nodded and said she'd be interviewing everyone in the house, that this was now a criminal investigation into child endangerment and possible attempted murder, given that Simone had knowingly locked me in during a medical emergency. The words attempted murder made something in my chest clench, the reality of how close I'd come to dying suddenly very real. Lindsay noticed my distress and suggested they let me rest before asking more questions, but I shook my head and said I wanted to finish, wanted to make sure they understood that Simone had done this deliberately, that it wasn't an accident or misunderstanding. Dad finally came into the room after Detective Flores finished her initial questions, his face gray and his eyes red like he'd been crying. He knelt beside the bed and grabbed my hand, saying he was sorry, so sorry, that he'd had no idea what was happening, that Simone had told him I was fine and just needed space. His voice was shaking when he asked why I hadn't come down if I was having a medical emergency, and I had to explain that I'd been locked in, that I'd tried to call and text, that I'd done everything I could to get help. The realization that his girlfriend had deliberately endangered his daughter while he'd been 20 feet away entertaining clients seemed to break something in him. He put his head down on the bed beside me and sobbed, and I found myself comforting him even though I was the one who'd almost died. Lindsay and Rick exchanged glances but didn't interfere, letting the moment play out while they prepared to transport me to the hospital for observation. Detective Flores stepped into the hallway to talk to Officer Nguyen, and I could hear her giving instructions about securing the scene and separating witnesses for interviews. The dinner party had apparently been disrupted when the paramedics forced their way in, and the Thorntons had left along with the catering staff, everyone giving statements to police about what they'd seen and heard. Simone was in the hallway being questioned by another officer when they wheeled me out on the stretcher. She looked perfect still, her cocktail dress unwrinkled and her makeup flawless, but her expression was cold fury barely contained behind a mask of concern. She tried to approach me, saying she'd been so worried and thank God I was okay, but Detective Flores physically blocked her and said she needed to stay back. Simone's mask slipped for just a second, her eyes flashing with something ugly before the concerned girlfriend performance resumed. She told my dad she'd only been trying to give me space to calm down, that she'd had no idea my blood sugar was dropping, that this was a terrible misunderstanding. Dad was following the stretcher, but he turned to look at her. Really look at her. And I saw something shift in his face. He asked her directly why she'd taken the key when she left my room, why she'd removed my glucose supplies from the kitchen, why she'd thrown away my juice box when I'd said I needed it. Simone's expression flickered through several emotions before settling on defensive anger, and she said she'd been trying to teach me responsibility and independence, that I'd been using my diabetes to manipulate him, and she was helping him establish boundaries. The words hung in the hallway like poison, revealing exactly what she'd been doing for months, and Dad's face went from grief to rage so fast I barely saw the transition. He told her to get out of his house, that she had exactly 1 hour to pack her things and leave before he called the police himself. The ambulance ride to UCLA Medical Center took 20 minutes, Lindsay staying with me in the back while Dad followed in his car. She kept checking my blood sugar and talking to me, making sure I stayed alert and responsive, asking about my normal management routine and how long I'd been type 1. When I explained my history, she said I'd been managing remarkably well considering the circumstances, that a lot of kids my age struggled with compliance, but my A1C numbers that I quoted showed excellent control. The validation felt important after months of Simone implying I was irresponsible and dramatic about my condition. Lindsay asked careful questions about other times Simone had interfered with my diabetes management, and I realized there'd been dozens of small incidents I'd minimized or explained away. The times she'd insisted I couldn't test my blood sugar at the dinner table because it was unsanitary, making me go to the bathroom and miss the timing I needed for insulin dosing. The times she'd questioned whether I really needed snacks between meals or if I was just trying to eat junk food. The times she'd suggested to Dad that maybe I was exaggerating my symptoms to get attention, that teenagers were known for drama and I'd probably be fine if everyone just ignored my complaints. Each memory felt different now, not like misunderstandings but like calculated attempts to undermine my health management and my relationship with Dad. Lindsay listened without judgment and said she was documenting everything for the police report, that this pattern would be important evidence. At the hospital, I was admitted to the pediatric unit for observation, standard protocol for severe hypoglycemic episodes. My blood sugar had stabilized at 98, safely normal, but Dr. Benjamin Clark, the attending endocrinologist who'd been called in, wanted to monitor me overnight to ensure there were no complications. Dr. Clark was in his 50s with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, and he'd been practicing pediatric endocrinology for 26 years according to the credentials on the wall. He reviewed my medical history with Dad and me, asking detailed questions about my management routine and what had led to tonight's crisis. When I explained about Simone restricting my access to glucose and locking me in my room, his expression went carefully blank in that way doctors have when they're hearing something that triggers mandatory reporting protocols. He excused himself and returned 10 minutes later with a woman he introduced as Vanessa Marks, a social worker with Child Protective Services who specialized in medical neglect cases. Vanessa was maybe 40, with warm brown eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that made me feel instantly safer. She pulled up a chair beside my bed and said she needed to hear my story directly, that what had happened tonight constituted serious medical neglect and possibly deliberate endangerment. I told the story again, this time with Dad sitting beside me hearing all the details I'd never told him about Simone's behavior over the past months. I watched his face as I described each incident, saw him making connections he'd missed while it was happening, understanding how systematically she'd been isolating me and undermining my health management. Vanessa took careful notes and asked clarifying questions, particularly about whether Simone had prevented me from accessing medical care or diabetes supplies on other occasions. When I mentioned her moving my emergency glucose to hard-to-reach places and her comments that I was exaggerating symptoms, Vanessa nodded like she'd heard similar patterns before. She explained that adults responsible for children with medical conditions had legal obligations to provide access to necessary treatments, and deliberately preventing that access could constitute abuse under California law. She said CPS would be opening an investigation, that Detective Flores was already coordinating with her office, and that they'd be examining whether Dad's home was safe for me given what had happened. Dad's face went white at that, and he asked if they were going to take me away. Vanessa's expression softened, and she said that wasn't the goal, that the investigation was about determining what safeguards needed to be in place, but that Simone could no longer have access to me or be present in the home where I lived. Detective Flores arrived around 10 that evening with updates about the investigation. She'd interviewed the catering staff, and 2 of them had witnessed the juice box incident, corroborating my account that Simone had taken necessary medical supplies from me despite my explaining I needed them. She'd also interviewed the Thorntons, who'd provided an interesting perspective on the dinner party. Apparently, when the paramedics had forced their way in, Simone had tried to prevent them from going upstairs, insisting that I was fine and just being dramatic. One of the paramedics had heard my CGM alarm from the 2nd floor and pushed past her anyway, and the Thorntons had seen Simone's mask slip completely, her concern disappearing into fury at having her evening disrupted. Mrs. Thornton had specifically told Detective Flores that Simone's behavior had struck her as wrong, that she'd seemed more concerned about the dinner party than about a medical emergency, and that she'd actually tried to convince the paramedics to leave before checking on me. That testimony was damning. Outside witnesses with no reason to lie describing behavior that showed Simone's priorities. Detective Flores said she'd also obtained the 911 recording from my phone call, that although I'd been largely incoherent, I'd managed to say locked in and dying before losing consciousness, providing evidence that I'd been aware of the deliberate confinement. The combination of physical evidence, witness testimony, and my statement was enough to file criminal charges, and the DA's office was reviewing for potential charges of child endangerment, false imprisonment, and assault. Dad stayed with me in the hospital room that night, sitting in the uncomfortable chair beside my bed even though I told him to go home and sleep. He looked like he'd aged years in a few hours, the reality of what had almost happened hitting him in waves. Around midnight, when I dozed off and woken up again, I found him staring at his phone with tears running down his face. He'd been reading through text messages between him and Simone from the past 8 months, seeing them differently now, recognizing manipulation he'd missed in the moment. He showed me some of them, messages where she'd subtly undermined me, told him I was being difficult about my diabetes management, suggested that I was jealous of their relationship and using medical situations to get attention. Dad said he'd believed her because she'd seemed so knowledgeable and confident, because he'd wanted to believe that someone could love him enough to take on the complexity of our life. He'd ignored his instincts that something was off because he'd been lonely, and Simone had seemed like an answer to that loneliness. He apologized again, more specifically this time, acknowledging that he'd failed to protect me, that he'd chosen his girlfriend's version of events over his daughter's reality, that he'd let someone dangerous into our home. I told him it wasn't his fault that Simone had been manipulative, but he shook his head and said it was his fault that he'd stopped paying attention, that he'd been so focused on his business and his relationship that he'd missed signs that should have been obvious. Dr. Clark released me the following afternoon with instructions to follow up with my regular endocrinologist and to ensure I had unrestricted access to diabetes supplies at all times. He documented the incident in detail and said the medical records would be available to law enforcement and CPS for their investigations. He also gave Dad a list of warning signs for medical neglect and abuse, emphasizing that chronic conditions required vigilant management and any interference with that management was serious. In the car ride home, Dad told me that Simone had left the house yesterday with 2 suitcases, that he'd had the locks changed that morning, and that he'd filed a restraining order with Detective Flores' assistance. Simone wasn't allowed within 100 yards of me or our home, wasn't allowed to contact either of us, and would face immediate arrest if she violated those terms. He'd also contacted a family law attorney named Patricia Blackwood, who specialized in custody and protection cases, and she'd advised him to document everything and cooperate fully with CPS to demonstrate that he was taking the situation seriously and ensuring my safety. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for next week, and Patricia said Simone would likely fight it, claiming it was all a misunderstanding and that I'd been having a medical episode she hadn't understood. The house felt different when we got home, emptier but also safer with Simone's presence scrubbed from it. Dad had removed all her belongings, everything from her designer furniture to the photos she'd hung on the walls, leaving spaces that looked bare but felt cleaner. He'd also restored my diabetes supplies to their original locations, putting emergency glucose back on the kitchen counter and in multiple rooms, ensuring I'd never be more than a few steps from help if I needed it. He'd printed out my CGM sharing permissions and installed the app on his phone so he could monitor my blood sugar levels remotely. Something Simone had convinced him was invasive helicopter parenting, but that was actually standard practice for Type 1 management. He was overcompensating, I could tell, hovering and asking if I needed anything every few minutes. But I let him because we both needed the reassurance that came from vigilance. Anya came over that evening with flowers and chocolate-covered pretzels, my favorite comfort food that I could eat if I dosed insulin correctly. She'd been following my sparse text updates and had been worried sick when I'd gone silent during the hypoglycemic episode. She said she'd almost called the police herself but had hoped I was just sleeping. Now she felt guilty she hadn't acted on her instincts, and I had to tell her the same thing I'd told Dad, that Simone's manipulation had been so effective that no one had seen what was really happening until it was almost too late. The criminal case moved forward faster than I'd expected. Within 3 days, the district attorney's office filed charges against Simone Blackwell for child endangerment, false imprisonment, and assault. The assault charge was based on her forcibly pushing me into my room and her physical removal of medical supplies I'd needed, actions that constituted harmful contact under California law. Detective Flores called to explain that the DA took these cases seriously, especially when there was clear evidence and witness testimony, and that Simone had been arrested that morning at her temporary apartment. Bail was set at $50,000, which her family posted immediately, but the conditions of her release included the restraining order and GPS monitoring to ensure she stayed away from us. Detective Flores said the case was strong, that between the 911 recording, the witness statements, the medical documentation, and my testimony, there was little room for Simone to claim ignorance or accident. The DA was pushing for a trial rather than a plea deal, wanting to make an example of someone who deliberately endangered a child with a medical condition. The trial was scheduled for 3 months out, standard timing for criminal proceedings, and Detective Flores said I'd need to testify. The thought terrified me but also felt necessary, like I needed to stand up in court and say publicly what Simone had done. CPS closed their investigation 2 weeks later with a finding of substantiated medical neglect against Simone, but no charges against Dad. Vanessa Marks met with us to explain that the investigation had determined Dad had been an unwitting victim of Simone's manipulation, that he'd had no knowledge of her interference with my diabetes management, and that he'd taken immediate corrective action once he'd understood the situation. She said the home was now considered safe for me, but she was recommending family counseling to help us process what had happened and rebuild trust. She also suggested I speak with a therapist individually to work through the trauma of the incident, particularly the terror of being locked in during a medical emergency. Dad agreed to everything, already having scheduled appointments with a family therapist named Dr. Robert Hayes, who specialized in trauma recovery. Dr. Hayes was in his 60s with a calming presence, and in our first session, he helped us start untangling the guilt and anger and fear that had become knotted together. He worked with Dad on understanding how he'd been manipulated and on rebuilding his confidence in his parenting judgment. He worked with me on processing the betrayal of someone who should have protected me instead trying to kill me, and on separating that experience from my ability to trust people in the future. The restraining order hearing happened 3 weeks after the incident, and it was my first time seeing Simone since that night. She looked different in court, less polished and more desperate, her expensive clothes rumpled and her makeup inadequate to hide the stress. Her attorney argued that the restraining order was excessive, that Simone had made an error in judgment but hadn't intended harm, that she was willing to apologize and make amends. Patricia Blackwood, Dad's attorney, presented the evidence methodically. The medical records showing how close I'd come to dying, the witness statements describing Simone's behavior, the timeline showing her deliberate actions despite knowing I was in crisis. She played portions of the 911 recording where my slurred voice begged for help, and I watched Simone's face as she heard it, saw no remorse, only calculation about how this was affecting her case. The judge, a woman named Honorable Christine Alvarez who'd been on the bench for 15 years, listened to everything and then delivered her ruling. She found that Simone posed a credible threat to my safety, that her actions had been deliberate and knowing, and that the restraining order would remain in place for 5 years with possible extension depending on the outcome of the criminal trial. Judge Alvarez also noted that Simone's lack of apparent remorse in court was concerning, that she seemed more focused on minimizing her actions than acknowledging the harm she'd caused. Simone's face went hard at that, the mask finally dropping completely, and for just a moment I saw the person who'd locked me in my room and walked away. The trial started in late October, 3 months after the incident, and media coverage was extensive. Local news had picked up the story, framing it as a cautionary tale about adults who refused to take children's medical conditions seriously, and the courthouse was packed with journalists and advocates for diabetic children's rights. The prosecution, led by Deputy DA Monica Lawson, who'd been trying criminal cases for 19 years, presented a methodical case building from the beginning of Simone's relationship with Dad through to the night she'd locked me in my room. Monica called witnesses in strategic order, first the catering staff who'd seen the juice box incident, then the paramedics who'd found me unconscious, then Dr. Clark who explained the medical severity of hypoglycemia, then Detective Flores who walked through the evidence and investigation. Each witness added another layer of damning testimony, painting a picture of deliberate endangerment that was impossible to explain away as accident or ignorance. When it was my turn to testify, Monica walked me through the events carefully, asking specific questions that let me tell the story in my own words while ensuring all the legal elements were covered. I explained about my diabetes management, about Simone's months of interference, about the specific threats she'd made that afternoon, about hearing the key turn in the lock while my blood sugar was crashing. I described the terror of being trapped, of knowing I was dying and being unable to get help, of hearing the dinner party continuing while I lost consciousness on my bedroom floor. Simone's defense attorney, a man named Gerald Foster who specialized in criminal defense, tried to create reasonable doubt by suggesting I'd locked myself in accidentally, that Simone had been unaware of the severity of my condition, that she'd been acting on advice from pharmaceutical colleagues who'd told her teenagers sometimes exaggerated symptoms. His cross-examination was aggressive, implying I'd been a difficult teenager who resented Simone's presence and had created situations to turn Dad against her. He asked whether I'd ever lied about my blood sugar levels, whether I'd ever skipped insulin doses intentionally, whether I'd ever used my diabetes to get attention or avoid responsibilities. Patricia had prepared me for this strategy, explaining that defense attorneys would try to attack my credibility, and I answered each question calmly, honestly, acknowledging the times I'd been less than perfect in my management, but explaining that none of that justified being locked in a room during a medical emergency. The jury watched these exchanges carefully, and I could see several of them looking at Simone with open disgust, particularly when Gerald suggested I'd somehow orchestrated the whole situation to frame an innocent woman. The suggestion was so absurd, so cruel, that even Gerald seemed to realize he'd lost the jury with that approach. The prosecution's closing argument was devastating. Monica Lawson walked the jury through every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every documented moment of Simone's deliberate interference with my medical care. She pointed out that Simone had worked in pharmaceuticals, that she'd known what hypoglycemia was and what the consequences could be, that her claims of ignorance were completely contradicted by her professional background. She played the 911 recording again, my voice barely audible as I'd begged for help while locked in my room, and she asked the jury to imagine their own children in that situation, trapped and dying while an adult who could help walked away. She reminded them that I'd been 15 years old with a manageable medical condition, that I should have been safe in my own home, that instead I'd nearly died because someone had decided that a business dinner was more important than a child's life. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: child endangerment, false imprisonment, and assault. Simone's face was blank as the verdicts were read, no emotion showing, but her hands were gripping the defense table hard enough that her knuckles were white. Judge Alvarez scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks out, and Simone was remanded to custody pending that hearing, the judge noting that she'd shown no remorse and posed a flight risk given the potential prison time she was facing. Sentencing day was cold and rainy, appropriate weather for the occasion. The courtroom was full again, this time with victim advocates and medical professionals who'd submitted statements about the importance of taking children's medical conditions seriously. Judge Alvarez heard from multiple witnesses during the sentencing phase, including Dr. Patel, my regular endocrinologist, who explained that my diabetes management had been excellent before Simone's interference and that her actions had put me at risk for permanent complications. She heard from Dr. Clark, who provided expert testimony that my blood sugar level of 29 represented immediate life-threatening crisis, that another 10 minutes without intervention could have caused permanent brain damage or death. She heard from Vanessa Marks, who explained that medical neglect cases were particularly serious because vulnerable children depended on adults for survival. And she heard from me, a victim impact statement I'd written and revised dozens of times, trying to capture the lasting impact of being betrayed by someone who should have protected me. I explained that I still had nightmares about being locked in that room, that I was anxious about my blood sugar dropping because I now associated hypoglycemia with being trapped and helpless. I said that Simone had taken something from me I'd never get back, the assumption that adults in my life would prioritize my safety over their own convenience. Judge Alvarez sentenced Simone to 8 years in state prison, the maximum allowed under California sentencing guidelines for the combined charges. She explained that the sentence reflected the deliberate nature of Simone's actions, her abuse of a position of trust, her lack of remorse, and the serious harm she'd caused. She noted that Simone had prioritized her social image over a child's life, that she'd systematically undermined medical care for months, and that her actions on the night of the dinner party had been calculated and knowing. She said that adults responsible for children had fundamental obligations to protect them, and violating those obligations in such an egregious way demanded serious consequences. Simone would be eligible for parole after serving 85% of her sentence, approximately 6 years, but Judge Alvarez recommended the parole board consider her lack of remorse when evaluating her release. As Simone was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, she finally looked at me, and her expression was pure hatred, no pretense remaining. She'd lost everything, her freedom, her reputation, her future, and she blamed me for that rather than accepting responsibility for her own actions. I met her eyes and felt nothing, no fear, no anger, just the cold certainty that justice had been served and she could never hurt me again. Dad and I left the courthouse to a crowd of journalists asking for statements, but Patricia Blackwood handled them while we slipped out a side entrance. The media attention had been overwhelming throughout the trial, my story becoming a focal point for discussions about medical neglect and the unique vulnerabilities of children with chronic conditions. Diabetes advocacy groups had used the case to push for better education about type 1 management and for stronger protections for children who needed medical support. I'd received hundreds of messages from other type 1 diabetics who'd experienced similar dismissals of their symptoms or interference with their care, people who said seeing someone held accountable gave them hope that their experiences were being taken seriously. The attention was exhausting, but also validating, proof that what had happened to me mattered beyond just my individual experience. In the weeks after sentencing, several medical organizations updated their guidelines about recognizing and reporting medical neglect, specifically including examples like adults preventing access to glucose or insulin. Schools revised their policies about diabetes management, ensuring students had unrestricted access to supplies and couldn't be prevented from treating hypoglycemia. The changes felt like something good emerging from trauma, like Simone's cruelty had accidentally created awareness that might protect other kids. 6 months after the trial, Dad and I had settled into a new normal. We'd done intensive family therapy with Dr. Hayes, working through the guilt and broken trust and fear that had almost destroyed our relationship. Dad had learned to be more vigilant about my medical management without being overbearing, and I'd learned to speak up more clearly about my needs without fear that asking for help would cause problems. We'd established new routines and boundaries, things like Dad checking in about my blood sugar without judgment and me being honest about when I was struggling instead of trying to hide it to avoid seeming difficult. The house had been redecorated, all the spaces Simone had occupied filled with furniture and photos that reflected our actual life together, not some performance of perfection. Dad had taken a step back from his business expansion plans, deciding that being present for me was more important than landing bigger contracts. Ironically, the Thorntons had reached out after the trial to express their support, and they'd ended up giving Dad an even better contract than the original dinner party had been intended to secure. Mrs. Thornton said they valued integrity over social performance, and Dad's immediate protective response once he'd understood the situation had impressed them more than any carefully staged dinner ever could have. I'd started a blog about diabetes management from a teenager's perspective, sharing both practical advice and stories about navigating medical conditions while growing up. The blog had gained a surprising following, connecting me with other young people dealing with chronic illnesses and creating a community of support I hadn't known I needed. Writing about my experience had been therapeutic, turning trauma into advocacy, and the response from readers had shown me that speaking truth about difficult experiences could help others feel less alone. Anya had become even more involved in my diabetes management, learning about hypoglycemia symptoms and how to administer glucagon, becoming the kind of emergency backup I needed in case anything happened when Dad wasn't around. She'd also been my biggest supporter through the trial and recovery, showing up with distraction and normalcy when everything felt overwhelming. The friendship had deepened through crisis, and I'd learned that real support meant people who believed you and acted on that belief, not people who performed concern while prioritizing other things. A year after the incident, I testified before the California State Legislature about medical neglect and the need for better protections for children with chronic conditions. The testimony was part of a broader push for legislation that would make interference with a child's medical care explicitly criminal, closing loopholes that had sometimes let people claim ignorance or accident. I explained my experience in clinical detail, describing how systematic interference had nearly killed me, and I urged lawmakers to take these cases as seriously as they took physical abuse. The committee chair thanked me for my courage in speaking publicly, and several legislators mentioned my case specifically when they introduced the Medical Care Protection Act, legislation that would strengthen reporting requirements and increase penalties for adults who deliberately prevented children from accessing necessary medical treatment. The bill passed both houses and was signed into law 6 months later, and knowing that my trauma had contributed to systemic change helped me process what had happened. Simone had tried to silence me, had tried to make my needs invisible, but instead her cruelty had amplified my voice in ways she'd never anticipated. I'm 19 now, managing my type 1 diabetes confidently, attending UCLA and studying public health with a focus on chronic disease management in vulnerable populations. My A1C is consistently in excellent range, proof that I've maintained the control I always had despite Simone's attempts to undermine it. Dad and I are close again, not the same relationship we had before, but something deeper, built on tested trust and proven commitment. He never dated seriously after Simone, focusing instead on rebuilding our family and supporting my goals. We still talk about that night sometimes, processing layers of trauma and manipulation that continue to reveal themselves years later. The physical scars are minimal, just some minor cognitive impacts from the prolonged severe hypoglycemia that occasionally affect my memory, but the emotional scars have required ongoing work to heal. Therapy continues, probably will for a long time, helping me separate what happened from who I am and ensuring that Simone's actions don't define my relationship with trust or vulnerability. The locked door still appears in nightmares occasionally, but less frequently now, and when it does, I wake up knowing I'm safe, that the door is unlocked, that I have supplies within reach, that people who love me are listening for me. Simone is still in prison, coming up for parole consideration next year. I've already submitted a statement to the parole board detailing why I believe she remains a danger, citing her complete lack of remorse and the calculated nature of her actions. Detective Flores told me that prison records show she's never taken responsibility, never acknowledged wrongdoing, maintains that she was the victim of a teenage manipulation scheme. That continued denial actually helps the case for denying parole, proving she hasn't rehabilitated or learned from her actions. I'm prepared to testify at her parole hearing if necessary, to stand up once again and say that locking a diabetic child in a room while she died served 8 years but deserves every day of it. The state agrees with me, Dad agrees with me, and most importantly, I agree with myself. She nearly killed me for a dinner party, for her image, for her need to control. Some actions don't deserve forgiveness, only consequences, and I've made peace with being the person who ensures she faces those consequences fully. Anya asks sometimes if I'm angry that I'll never get those months back, the fear and manipulation and near death that changed my life's trajectory. The answer is complicated. I'm angry about what happened, about the betrayal and the cruelty and the system that almost let someone kill me in my own home. But I'm also grateful in strange ways, grateful that I survived, that my voice mattered, that the experience taught me about strength I didn't know I had. I learned that I could face someone in court and tell the truth, that I could turn trauma into advocacy, that surviving crisis sometimes meant you got to help others survive theirs. Would I choose to go through it again? Never. But since I did go through it, I'm choosing to let it mean something beyond just surviving. That night when Simone locked the door and walked away, she thought she was silencing a problem. Instead, she created a voice that people actually heard, and in the end, that voice locked her away instead. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.